Professor Brotton is a British historian and Professor of Renaissance Studies at Queen Mary University London, a television and radio presenter and a curator. He writes about literature, history, material culture, trade and East-West relations, particularly in the 16th and 17th centuries. He employs interdisciplinary approaches looking at art, politics, history, travel writing and literature. And his book, A History of the World in 12 Maps, has been translated into 12 languages and accompanied by a 3-part series on BBC 4. That's all I'm going to say right now.
That's it. That's all you need to say.
Thank you very much.
Oh, we have a mic. I like to walk around, so it'd be nice to talk more because I don't just want to read off a script, which would be very boring. Might not be able to. How's that? Should be fine. Yeah, great, thank you. Okay. Do you have some images coming up? We do. We have some images. I'd like to really thank you all for the invitation to come here. For me, this is a great honor. It really is a tremendous honor. Because to be able, I think, to talk to the Harrow Mosque about relations between Islam and the Christian world in the 16th century is precisely why I wrote the book that I did. I didn't just want to speak to academics. I didn't just want to speak, frankly, to white Christian people. I wanted this to be a story about the longer history of how there are connections and exchanges between various aspects of Islam and various aspects of England, and England in the 16th century. I was saying we had a wonderful dinner just before I came, which was also really lovely to meet some of the congregation, to talk about the way in which my own history has informed what I'm going to talk about. I grew up in Bradford in the 1970s. And so for me, as some of you will know, that context of Bradford and the multiculturalism of Bradford, it's really important for me to think about that in terms of what we're going to talk about. But are you going to have a bit of a tricky thing with the images? No, you're on it, all right. Yeah? Never work with images, it's a very bad idea. There's always some trouble. You can't stay up there all the time.
It wasn't working.
Aha! Oh, beep. I hear a beep. Yay. Did that one come on? Please be careful. Sorry. You all fall asleep then? No, that's true. No pressure. This is where it could go very wrong. Ah, lovely. Great. Right. Can I just cue you when we need another one? Great. Okay. I wrote this book in 2016, and it was called This Orient Isle. Oh, thank you. Great, I could do it myself. So the book was called This Orient Isle, Elizabethan England and the Islamic World. So what I wanted to talk about was this, really important moment, I guess, in English history, the Tudors. We always think of the Tudors as being about Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, and everybody's always ginger-haired and white. This is simply not the reality of the history of that period. It's simply wrong, okay? It is simply wrong. And what I want to talk to you about is why that's wrong, and some of the history that surrounds it, which I hope might interest you. So I'm going to start by showing that image, and the images aren't too bad. Does anybody know who that is? Yeah, he's Suleiman the Magnificent. What's interesting, and I want to keep referring to this in terms of the audience and the different audiences around the stories that I tell. If I show this image at a literary festival, which is predominantly, has sort of white English people there, nobody knows who that is. So I start by saying, isn't that interesting? The Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, he rules from 1520 to 1566. He is the greatest emperor in the 16th century. He's bigger than any of the Spanish emperors, the French kings, the Pope, right? He owns more of the world than anybody else. And yet, the stories that we tell about the 16th century, especially within a sort of white Anglo-American tradition, seem to sort of forget that a little bit. So I start the story with this figure, Suleiman the Magnificent. And I want to tell you a story about an Englishman who meets Suleiman the Magnificent in 1553. And there's an English merchant called Anthony Jenkinson. He's a textile merchant. And he's working in the Eastern Mediterranean in the 1550s. And he travels to Aleppo. So he's in Aleppo in 1553. Now again, many of you will know that Aleppo in that period is the terminus of the Silk Route. So all the great goods that are coming from China westwards are terminating in, should we just wait a second, because that looks a little bit tricky. Hello. You okay? Hi. Okay. Can you see that? Is that okay? Great. Okay. So I have an Englishman, Anthony Jenkinson, in 1553 in Aleppo. And there he is in Aleppo, and he meets Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent in 1553. What's interesting is that Suleiman is in Aleppo in 1553 because he's leading a Sunni Ottoman army eastwards to fight Shia Persian Safavid imperial power in the east. So you have an Englishman meeting a Sunni ruler going to fight Shia in the east. This kind of extraordinary moment. And the Englishman goes and Jenkinson meets Suleiman, and he's granted the first trading privileges from the Ottomans to the English in history. And he does a deal with the Sultan. That's actually extraordinary in its own right, the fact that an English trader can do this, and he can get to Suleiman the Magnificent, is kind of extraordinary. So I start the story here. We're in 1553. Jenkinson goes because he feels like he's an inferior. He's a supplicant to the Ottomans. He does this trading deal. He comes back to England, and Elizabeth I comes to the throne. So he comes back. We're in Elizabeth I's time. And he's seen as so successful in terms of what he does that he's then sent back out as part of the Muscovy Company. So it's a trading company called the Muscovy Company. Its name suggests that it's connected to Russia, but it's not. The Muscovy Company is about trading with Persia. So Jenkinson, having met Suleiman, is then sent back out via Moscow to go to visit the Persian Shah Tahmasp. And he goes to Kazvin in 1562, and he meets the Shia Shah. He's met Sunni Ottoman ruler, and now he's working with the Shia in Persia. He tries to do a deal with the Persians and it doesn't work out. But what's amazing is that I have records of this guy in 1560s talking about the theological distinction between Sunni and Shia. An Englishman in the 1560s? Now, what I always say now is that how do you expect Anglo-American foreign policy to have any understanding of Middle Eastern politics, as you all know, when most of those people couldn't even tell you today the theological distinctions between Sunni and Shia, okay? And yet I've got Englishmen in 1560s who are trying to work that one out. It's not to say that they're any better, but at that time, you have a sense in which they're trying to understand what these theological distinctions are within Islam. So that's in the 1560s. Jenkinson's story is great. I tell the story in the book about he's a fascinating character, and he carries on working in Persia. But the Persian embassy doesn't really prosper. It becomes very much about the Ottomans. So I want to now move on and tell you a little bit more about why that is. When Elizabeth comes to the throne, she is, of course, a Protestant. Now, again, what's really interesting is, having talked about Sunni and Shia, Europe and Christian states in Europe are also having debates about the breakup of their own religious orthodoxy. So, of course, you now have Protestants and Catholics, and Elizabeth is a Protestant. She knows that most of Europe is Catholic-dominated and that she's probably going to be invaded by Spanish Catholicism. So what does she do? Well, one thing which is really interesting, so this image is very unclear, but this is an image of Martin Luther. If you can see the great Protestant reformer Martin Luther, this is his name, this is in German, and this is the seven heads of Martin Luther. So this is an anti-Lutheran German print created by Catholics to say, isn't Luther terrible? And look at what they do. They give him all these different heads. So these are the 7 different heads of Luther. What interests me is that one. He's wearing a turban. So what Catholics saying about Protestants in the 16th century are Protestants are heretics. And they're heretics just as Catholics see Muslims as being heretics. So they compare Protestants with Muslims. So if you're a Lutheran, then you're probably in league with Islam. That's the weird connection that happens in this period. So Elizabeth I comes along and says, well, I'm being called a heretic. And she is, indeed, she's excommunicated. In 1570, the Catholics officially excommunicate Elizabeth I from the Catholic Church. They say, you're out. She's excommunicated. And this is the papal bull, the bull by Pope Pius V, which excommunicates her. So Elizabeth is officially out of the church. She was always out of the church because she professed Protestantism. But now it's official. So what does Elizabeth do? How do you respond to that? Well, one thing that's really interesting is that throughout this period of history, there has been official papal statements that if you're a Christian, you cannot trade with heretics and infidels. You cannot trade with Muslims. This is also nonsense because the Venetians had been doing it for hundreds and hundreds of years. But the official line is that you couldn't trade with heretics. So Elizabeth I says, okay, well, if I'm a heretic, then I can trade with other heretics. And what she does is she reaches out to various Islamic empires and says, well, I want to trade with you. So over the next 10 years, throughout the 1570s and 1580s, she sends an ambassador to Istanbul, as was Constantinople. Another man who I don't have a picture of. It's very interesting, these stories of these Protestant merchants who are going to work in Islamic lands. And they're just like us. They're not posh, they're not aristocratic, they're not very wealthy, so they never have their portrait painted. So I don't have pictures of Anthony Jenkinson, I don't have pictures of this man William Harborne, who goes to Istanbul in 1578. But one of the stories that I want to tell is that, again, within the English-speaking world, we've seen that whole period as completely the wrong way around. If you go from Norfolk, which is where William Harborne is born, and you go to Istanbul in 1578, you are seeing the most sophisticated, cosmopolitan, amazing city, like nothing you see in Christian Europe, okay? It's not the sense in which the great cultured civilizations are in Northern Europe. They're not. They're all in Istanbul and to the east. They're all in North Africa, right? And people like Harborne knew this. So we've got the history, I think, completely the wrong way around here. It's England who feels inferior. It's Elizabeth who goes to the Islamic world and says, can you help me out? Right? Not the other way around. Not the other way around. And that's, of course, always the story that, as I say often in the English-speaking historical tradition, that's what we've been told. It's wrong, it's nonsense. I can tell you it's wrong. Right? It's wrong. And here are some really interesting examples of it. So Harborne goes in 1578. He goes to Istanbul. They accept him as the English ambassador, and they say that's absolutely fine. And the Ottoman Emperor Murad III says, fine, absolutely fine. You can come here, you can trade with us, you can work with us, absolutely no problem. And again, the story then is that the Islamic Empire says it is a sign of our power and authority that we can invite anybody in to work with us because we are so powerful. England's not doing this. It's the other way around. England's scared, right, of different cultures coming in. Murad says, I've got Jews here, I've got Venetians, I've got Indians, I've got everybody who wants to trade here, they can come here, that's fine, because it's a sign of my power and my ability to keep these people here. And he says, if you're English, actually what's interesting is in the records, he says, who? Where? Where are you from? Who's your ruler? A woman? Oh, that is complete. Honestly, the documentation is really funny. In the first few years of the diplomatic correspondence between the Ottoman court and the English court, they can't even spell Elizabeth's name correctly because they just don't understand it. They just don't get it. And of course, the English don't come with very much. They want what the Ottomans have, not the other way around. So, also the other thing that I think is fascinating about this period is that if you're a Protestant Englishman, and it is mainly men, although subsequently there are women who are travelling in Islamic lands, more in the 17th century. But if you're a Protestant Englishman and you're travelling outside England, you're better off in Islamic domains than in Central European Catholic places. Because if you're in Central Catholic Europe, you'll be arrested for heresy and you'll be thrown to the Inquisition. If you're in Ottoman lands, you're welcome. So again, the story is really the wrong way around that we think about all these theological differences. So what's interesting is that Harborne's there, and Harborne starts to work with the Ottoman court to develop a trade deal. It's quite interesting, a trade deal outside Europe. Which involves, really interestingly, the fascinating story here is that he's mainly taking scrap metal to Istanbul because the Ottomans need armaments because of the conflict in Persia. What does Elizabeth sanction? She says, melt down Catholic church bells and send the metal, this is absolutely true, and send the metal over to Istanbul. So this is a sort of arms to Iraq story in the 1570s. And there's a sort of weird humour here that she's saying, well, if this is what the Catholics want, then that's fine. So you've got this extraordinary situation where Protestant munitions from England are being shipped to the Ottoman territories to use in conflicts not only in Persia, but also in the Eastern Mediterranean in terms of attacks on Catholics. But it's the Protestants that are making this interesting alliance with Islam. And this is just a quote, I hope you can see it, but anyway I can read it out, which is how furious the Spanish are. This is a Spanish ambassador writing in 1582, talking about how angry the Spanish Catholics are because the Protestant English are now in this alliance with the Ottomans. And he says 2 years ago, they, the English, opened up the trade, which they still continue to the Levant, to the Eastern Mediterranean, which is extremely profitable to them, as they take great quantities of tin and lead thither, which the Turk buys of them almost for its weight in gold, the tin being vitally necessary for the casting of guns, and the lead for purposes of war. It is of double importance to the Turk now in consequence of the excommunication proposed ipse facto by the Pope, which I'd just shown you, upon any person who provides or sells to infidels such as these. So there again, it's interesting, there's not a theological upset on the part of the Catholics. They're just annoyed that the Protestants have got the better trade. So I think it's kind of an amazing moment. And now I'll just show you, this is Sultan Murad III, from a miniature from the Ottoman court. So this is who Elizabeth's dealing with, and she's writing amicably to Murad to set up this alliance. And she starts writing letters to him from 1579, and she proposes an alliance between Protestant England and the Ottoman Empire, which is about trade, but it's also about a military alliance against Catholics. Who's our common enemy? It's actually Catholicism. And she writes this really interesting letter, which again gives you a very different understanding, just the beginning of the letter, which shows you the sort of way that Elizabeth is talking to Murad. And she is going cap in hand to him. It's not the other way around. She's saying, please, can we have an alliance? You know, we're being absolutely taken down by the Catholics. We need your help. And she writes to him in 1579, she says, Elizabeth, by the grace of the most mighty God, the only creator of heaven and earth, which is interesting how she uses theology. She says that she's Queen of England, yes. France, not so much. Ireland, no, not really. But she's trying to big herself up. She's trying to say, I'm really important over here in Northern Europe. And Murad's going, who, where, what? The most invincible and most mighty defender of the Christian faith against all kind of idolatries. Yeah, you see what she's doing. She's saying, we, like you, are people of the book. We don't believe in intercession. We don't believe in the veneration of saints, of what the Catholics do. We are people of the book. We can do business. We can work together. Really extraordinary the way she's making that alliance. Of all that live among the Christians and falsely profess the name of Christ. So she's there again saying, those terrible Catholics who don't understand Christ. But look what she's doing really interestingly. She's not saying, by the way, we as Protestants believe that Christ is the Son of God. So she's not getting into the Trinitarian Protestant tradition. So she's quietly, I think she's there acknowledging, saying, Islam obviously understands Jesus as a prophet, but we're not talking about him as the Son of God. So she's being very clever here about trying to make the alliance with Islam. And then she says, I'm writing to you, the most imperial and most invincible prince, Sultan Murad III, the most mighty ruler of the kingdom of Turkey, sole and above all the most sovereign monarch of the East Empire, greeting and many happy and fortunate years. This does not sound to me like somebody who is dismissing or denigrating this Islamic ruler, okay? Quite the contrary again. I keep thinking about, the metaphor to think about is, we've been looking down this history the wrong end of the telescope. Right? Turn the telescope round, it looks very, very different. These are the kind of letters that Murad then writes back to Elizabeth. And I'm not going to talk really about them too much, but to say the archives in London are full of this documentation. They're full of letters from an Islamic ruler to a Christian ruler in the 1570s and 80s. Why don't we pay attention to these? There's loads of this stuff. But no, we've talked about the Spanish and the French and their connection to the English. This was probably the most important alliance that Elizabeth had in this period. And you can go down to Kew, to the Public Records Office, and you can pull up all these extraordinary letters. You can see the Tukhra, the Sultan's seal at the top. People have worked on translating this material. But again, of course, we haven't talked enough about it. It's so important. So this goes on, this exchange goes on throughout this period. William Harborne, the man who starts the trade, stays in Istanbul for 8 years. He works very closely with the Ottoman court. And the Ottomans also understand what's happening in terms of religious differences in Christianity. There's a wonderful moment where they refer to him, the Ottomans talk about Harborne as the Lutheran Elchizi, which means the Lutheran ambassador. They understand Lutheranism. And Harborne writes back to England and he says, I'm really annoyed because all the Turks are calling me a Lutheran ambassador and I'm a Calvinist. I'm a Calvinist, which is another sort of sect of Protestantism. But the Ottoman court clearly understands absolutely these divisions, these schisms within Christianity, and they're exploiting them as well. In 1580, with Elizabeth's agreement, Harborne signs a diplomatic alliance with the Ottomans, between the English and the Ottomans, which are called the capitulations. That's in 1580. It stays in place until 1922, when, of course, when the Turkish Empire falls and the Republic is created. But you talk about long-standing diplomatic alliances, that went from 1580 to 1922. It led to a whole series of English consuls that were established across the Eastern Mediterranean. So there were English men, some with their families. They were in Cairo, Alexandria, Damascus, Tripoli, Jerusalem, and Aleppo. Aleppo is a place that, of course, keeps coming up in this period. So you had a lot of Englishmen working within Islamic communities alongside Muslims, and some of them converted. This is, I think, an extraordinary image. Would you believe me if I told you that this person was a man called Samson Rowley? Samson Rowley is a Norfolk merchant who, in 1577, was captured by the Ottomans off Tripoli in the Mediterranean. He was forcibly, as the story goes, he was forcibly converted to Islam. But by the 1580s, he was known as Hassan Aga, and he was the chief eunuch and treasurer to the court of Algiers. So he'd converted, and this, you can see him as a convert. And what's really interesting is that William Harborne, our friend William Harborne, wrote to him in the 1580s, and he said, Hassan, because he wrote back and he said, I'm now Hassan Aga. And he said, would you like to come back? Would you like to revert to Protestantism? And our friend here, Hassan Aga, said, I live in a palace in Algiers. I'm one of the most important men in North Africa. Do you really want me to go back to Norfolk? It's absolutely true. It's absolutely true. So you have conversions, again, which we haven't really been told about, that yes, forcible conversions, but also willing conversions to Islam by Protestant Englishmen in this period. And to be frank, I would think if I was a Protestant at that time with the spectre of the Spanish Catholics about to invade at any point, either strategically or for good theological reasons, I can see why they do it. And these people just disappear. I assume that they remain Muslim, they live their lives out, they have families, and they disappear from the historical record. But that's the reality of what's going on in this period. And throughout this period, and I've spent a long time looking at it, I've found only one case of conversion going the other way. A figure called Chinano, he's called Chinano the Turk, and he's, with great celebration, converted to Anglicanism in 1586. And actually, I don't believe a word of it. I think he probably felt, better do this. So you have lots of examples of Englishmen converting to Islam, but it doesn't go the other way. You don't have cases of Muslims converting either forcibly or freely to Christianity. I find no records of it at all. I want to just do a little disclaimer here. I'm now going to show an image which shows Elizabeth I and a figure who is named as Muhammad. So I don't want to cause any offense by showing this image, but I want to show the kind of imagery that was being created at this time. So we're going to see Elizabeth I and a figure called Muhammad. It's interesting because I don't know whether there's a reference here to the Prophet Muhammad or it's a reference to Muhammad as a sort of generic Ottoman ruler. So that's my disclaimer. So what I show you is this image with the Elizabeth I figure here and the figure of figure named Muhammad, who is holding a book down here which is labelled the Al-Quran, the Quran, being represented on an English embroidery in the 1580s. And above this, the first attempt by English artists to represent a mosque. It's very schematic, it's very crude, but here it is in the 1580s. This is in a National Trust house in Derbyshire. As I say, I came from Bradford and I live in Oxford, so I worked out that when I was going home to see my parents, halfway between Oxford and Bradford is Hardwick Hall. And a few years ago, I stopped over there and I went into the house. And I have 3 young children, and I walked in and I was covered in ice cream and with these children screaming and running around. And I walked into the room and I went, why do you have an image of Elizabeth I and Muhammad in your front hall? And this poor National Trust woman, this sort of English lady, said, oh, goodness, I've no idea. And we've no idea why it was there, right? But it gives you a sense of how much the exchange between the Islamic world and the English world was going on at this time. All kinds of exchanges are going on. It's happening in North Africa as well. So throughout, from the 1560s actually, there's an alliance with the Barbary states. It's happening with the ruler of the Barbary states called Ahmad al-Mansur. It's similarly about selling arms to that region in exchange for sugar. You know the great story about Elizabeth I? She never smiled because she had very black teeth. I don't know if some of you heard this story. She never smiled because the teeth were so black because she loved sugar. Where was the sugar from? It was Moroccan sugar. It was Moroccan sugar that the English were trading for arms with Morocco, again in the fight against Catholics. So, you know, stories that we don't really hear about. And again, it's about the way in which the English were reaching out to the Barbary states of North Africa because they needed those alliances. But I guess the point about these kind of images, and maybe going back to Samson Rowley, is what happens to people who live their lives, right? Elizabeth I was not necessarily somebody who was trying to reach out for peaceful or, you know, amicable reasons necessarily to the Islamic world. But the consequences of what she did led English men and subsequently women to be living, trading, accommodating, sharing beliefs and ideas with Islamic communities in a way that we never thought had existed before. It's just, it wasn't part of the story that was told. It changed the English language. In this period, the English language changes, and it's partly because of the Anglo-Islamic trade and exchange that's going on. So if you look in the Oxford English Dictionary and you look up certain words, you see that they come in from Arabic and Persian traditions, only from this period. So words like sugar, candy, crimson, turquoise, indigo, tulip, turban, even zero. The word zero enters the language from the Arabic in this period as a result of the exchanges that are going on between the two communities. And I could go on and talk then about, this is a man called Anthony Shirley, who in 1598 runs off to Persia. He goes off, and again, this really interesting way in which the English court of Elizabeth is working mainly with Sunni Muslim states, but also trying, if it can, to work with Persia and with Shia communities. And this he's a crazy guy actually, called Anthony Shirley. He doesn't like, get this as a kind of complicated story, he doesn't like Elizabeth's pro-Ottoman policy, and he's actually secretly a Catholic. So he runs off to Persia, and he goes to Isfahan, and he makes a deal with, this is his brother, Robert Shirley, which is him in Oriental costume. This is his sort of Hello magazine version of this is what I did in Persia, in Isfahan. They go to Isfahan, and they become the servants of Shah Abbas, the Persian ruler, at this time in Isfahan. So Shirley goes out there to create an alliance, right, between Catholics in Europe, the Persian Shia against the Sunni Ottomans. How weird is that, right? And this guy's running around. He's even referenced, he's mentioned, because he's such a strange man, he's mentioned in Shakespeare's plays. They make a reference to Anthony Shirley being in Persia, working with the Shah, and his brother as well, Robert Shirley. So it gives you a sense of how far those kind of exchanges go. I want to end with one final image, which this is my all-time favorite image. This is a man called Muhammad al-Anuri. And he is the Moroccan ambassador who comes to England in 1600. And if the painting actually shows in the corner, gives you some quite clear detail. It's in Latin, but well, it says 1600, so that's the year that he comes to London with a big diplomatic entourage to work with Elizabeth I. There's an anglicised version of his name, Abu Lakhad, but he's known in the archives from the Barbary States as Muhammad al-Anuri. We're told that his age is 42 and that he's the royal diplomatic ambassador, legate, from the Barbary States in England in 1600. He comes, he stays for 6 months, he brings a huge entourage. Everybody's talking about him in London. They describe the entourage. They talk about how they pray. They talk about how they slaughter their meat halal. This is in 1600. And he's living in a palace on the Strand, because he's a representative of the Barbary States. He's a high-ranking diplomat. And you look at this man, right? This man is somebody who is powerful, okay? And he's doing a deal with Elizabeth because his boss, who's Ahmad Mansour says, I want another alliance with Elizabeth so that we can attack the Spanish. The only reason that the alliance breaks down is because Elizabeth says, I'd love to do this, but you're also now in conflict with the Ottomans, and we have a much more long-standing deal with the Ottomans. So she prefers one Islamic alliance to another. That's the only reason that this breaks down. But I'm sort of fascinated by this. He meets Elizabeth on 3 separate occasions. He has high-level commercial, diplomatic, and military deals with her. He stays for 6 months, and then he goes back. What's really interesting for me, in terms of the stuff that I do as well, is that shortly after he leaves, William Shakespeare writes a play called Othello, which is about a very powerful man from North Africa who may be a convert from Islam to Christianity, or we're not really sure. And he writes the play 6 months after this man leaves London. So when I say Shakespeare is intimately connected to Islam, I really mean it. I think that we can really make that claim. And we can say that the story of Tudor England and the story of Shakespeare is also a story of Islam. And that there's a very much longer story about Anglo-Islamic relations and all our communities here and all our connections and all our histories that go back much, much further than most white, Western European, English-speaking history will ever tell you. Now, I started by saying, I'm from Bradford. And I grew up in Bradford in the 1970s and 1980s, and I wouldn't in any way diminish conflicts around the multicultural society that happened then. But also for me, right, growing up, living with, hanging out with, playing cricket with Muslims, with Sikhs and Hindus, that was my notion of what it meant to be English. And that's why I write this history. And many of the white people from a Christian tradition have just ignored this. I'm here to tell you that history is different, and you're as much a part of that history as I am, as we all are, okay? And so what's happening at the moment in terms of the sort of Islamophobia, it seems to me, is so shocking because it doesn't acknowledge the sheer diversity of what we mean by saying we, whoever we is. The notion of Englishness is much broader and much wider than we might ever believe. And I should know because I'm a professor of English. So I'm here to say that that's the case. So I hope it's been interesting. And as I say, to sort of say, there are different stories about being English. It is not all about sort of being white and Christian, even in the 16th and 17th centuries. And we could probably, I think, as we start to go back, we'll find other points of encounter and exchange that go back even further. So let's tell that story, not the kind of story that's predominating and that is alienating so many people in the media at the moment by what we're told Englishness or Britishness, whatever those things are, is all about. because it's wrong and we should challenge it, and we should also be able to say, history is on our side. Thank you for listening. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very, very much. We have some time for questions. Any questions from either side?
Thank you very much, Jerry. Have you got any records of, from what I understood, that dressing as in Eastern attire was considered to be like, quite fashionable at that time?
So you have Henry VIII from the 1520s. Henry VIII he turns up to his birthday party and he's dressed like an Ottoman sultan. And what's interesting is that he's dressed in the old fashion. He's not up to date. So if you talk to Ottoman historians, they'll say, and they'll describe what Henry VIII is wearing. And we still have some of the paintings which sort of show him in Ottoman designs, and they'll say, oh, that was very 15 teens. He's sort of 20 years behind the day, right? And he's still trying to play catch-up. And any of those images that, we haven't got them in, but any of those classic Elizabethan paintings that you look at, I reckon many of you in this room would look at those and we're told that it's classic Tudor, it's English Tudor. And you'll go, hang on, that design's Persian, that design's Ottoman arabesque, right? The silk is from China and it's come to... It's all been imported. It's all classic English pick and mix and grab. There's nothing quintessentially English about it at all. Any costume designer now and dress historian will tell you that. And it goes right back through from Henry VIII. All those portraits that you see with Elizabeth, look at all the jewellery. It's all Arabic, Islamic, Persian jewellery. The great stories, I chopped out a little bit, which is that from the 1590s, when Murad III dies, his mother really takes over control of the Ottoman Sultanate. And she's the Ottoman Sultana. She starts writing to Elizabeth, and they start trading stuff. And she's sending all these kind of amazing things over to Elizabeth. And so Elizabeth says, I don't know what we can send her back. And they decide to send over a clockwork musical organ. They send this guy called Thomas Dallam, who's from Lancashire, over to Istanbul in 1599 to present the Ottoman Sultana with this organ. Elizabeth's got all this silk and she's got jewellery, and they send an organ. And this guy puts it together and he plays it at the Ottoman court, and they say, oh yeah, this is wonderful, yes, absolutely great, scratching their heads a bit. And the wonderful story, again, because it's all about dress and costume and exchange of these goods, the wonderful story that I found is that Dallam then says he travels back to England, and he travels through the Ottoman territories, and he's given a dragoman, an interpreter, to travel with him. He then says, a man that he calls a perfect Turk. So he says he's got a Turkish interpreter. He then discovers that the said Turkish interpreter is actually from Chorley in Lancashire. And he's a convert. He's lived as a Muslim for many, many years, and he becomes an interpreter. So he's sent to go back with Dallam. And Dallam says, Dallam's from near Wigan. And he says, this man from Lancashire, who I think is a Turk, is taking me back. And he says, we get to the Greek border, and he goes back to the Ottoman lands, and I go back to England. So I love the story of the organ in exchange for the goods and the dress that Elizabeth has. But all that stuff, if you see any portrait of Elizabeth now, you should look at it and say, oh, I don't even like using this word itself, but it's Oriental, right? Or you would say, oh yes, you can see Persian elements and Ottoman elements and North African elements. That is the bricolage of Englishness. It's been taken from all kinds of different sources and points, at a point where Elizabeth was going and saying, I am the inferior here, right? I want to trade with you because you are more powerful than anything that we have here. And we've tended to see, you see, if anybody don't watch those big Tudor programs, but you know, all those, the blockbuster Tudor programs, they all seem to suggest that England is this huge, it's not. England is a speck on the global world map, which we need to really reorientate with sort of Istanbul, and indeed really the Arabian Peninsula at its centre, And we're over there. We're not in the middle of it at all. And it's really only an 18th and 19th century imperial moment that puts that at the centre. And we all know where that ended up. Sorry, and was there a question here?
Let me first thank you so much for this. And I'm particularly noting the possible inspiration of Islamic figures in Shakespearean work. I've picked a few things. Some of what he says come almost exactly like the hadith of the Prophet. And I can now see some of the connection. I'm interested in the intellectual linkages, especially around the Renaissance. For example, the influence of Ghazali on Saint Aquinas, the influence of Ibn Arabi on Dante Alighieri with his Divine Comedy, and you find again some of the famous quotes of Alighieri are almost representation of the ayahs of the Quran. So there must be a lot in that. Has someone done much study in this particular? If I may add, I don't remember the name, but there was a Christian Palestinian who did his PhD on the sources of university status, the kind of document that establishes universities. And he went back, he said, in the 16th century, Florence and such Renaissance cities, most intellectuals then have to speak a few words of Arabic just to confirm that they're properly educated.
Yeah.
And they have to have Arabic books
Yeah.
in their shelves. So I expect that maybe more work has been done in that. Is this something that you'd like to say a few things
Yeah,
on?
well,
Thank you.
I started doing this work in the 1990s, and I wrote a book called The Renaissance Bazaar, which was about the Islamic influence on the high European Renaissance. And of course it was. The notion that there was these kind of absolute divisions between this meaningless sense of East and West, or Orient and Occident, which of course is all made up later. You know, people like Edward Said, the great Palestinian critic, said, you know, this whole notion of the Orient was all completely invented by 18th and 19th century European intellectuals. In this period, there was no sense in which you would sort of say, well, it's Arabic and therefore I won't read it. No, that's not what happened. And we know that there was a continuity through the medieval period of that cross-fertilization of learning, and through trade and exchange. You know, one of the great books on Venetian architecture by a woman called Deborah Howard says, if you go to Venice, you're brainwashed into going, it's a great Renaissance Italian city. And she says, she has this great line, she says, it's like a colossal souk, because the Venetians have been trading for nearly 500 years with the Arabic world, and they're working in Damascus, and that's their model for building a city. They're not suddenly inventing some sort of European vernacular tradition. And similarly, the philosophical tradition is also going through the Renaissance. It's a later moment. It's always back to that imperial moment. The 19th century says there's no Islamic, there's no Ottoman tradition. We wash it all out and we say there's something that's pure, white and Christian and predominantly male about the high European Renaissance. It's a nonsense. It's an absolute nonsense. And increasingly, we hope that the work will be done around bringing scholars together. So people who are working in Persian, people who are working in Arabic, people who are working in Turkish, in those archives. But now we know politically that that's also quite difficult. We see what's happening in somewhere like Turkey at the moment, where Erdogan's arrested most of the historians. You know, you think about what happened in Baghdad. I always used to say, with the bombing of Baghdad, it would be like bombing Florence, right? But as you know, the Western media just goes, oh, it's Baghdad. And I go, the destruction of not just art and culture, but for us, the archives, what we know was there that was just sort of just bombed into obliteration, is just devastating. And a loss of history and those stories that we could and should be telling. But it always gets so wrapped up, I think, in the politics and the imperial conflicts that has just literally whitewashed that tradition away.
The media doesn't allow it either.
Sorry?
The media does not allow it either.
No, absolutely not. We were talking about this before that earlier in the summer, The Guardian said, would you write a piece about Boris Johnson's just horrific, well, I was going to say horrific ignorance about Islam, but it was beyond that. We were talking about this earlier, that it was deliberately. Johnson, I'm sorry, politically I don't agree with him, but also he's shrewd, and it's a whipping up, it's an incitement to conflict. And the media sort of just go, yeah, well, that's the view. And The Guardian said, could you respond and could you say what's wrong with it? And you just have to go through and you have to keep refuting what's simply a lie. And within, as historians, I guess I call myself a historian, that you have to just say, there are facts, there are things that did happen and there are things that didn't happen. But of course the problem now is that that message is getting very, very warped. Because as long as Johnson shouts very loudly, that will be heard more loudly than other voices. But we've just got to keep refuting it, and we've got to keep saying it's wrong. And we've got to keep saying there are different histories that we can tell about exchange, meetings, amicability, because the problem is that people want to hear war and conflict are bigger stories, they're better stories, right? That's what always drives the media. You don't want a story about amicable exchange between cultures of people living together and making compromises, but actually living alongside each other and accepting each other's faiths, and maybe at times learning from each other. That's not a good news story. But actually, there's more of that, really, that's gone on historically. So let's not forget that. So yes, I think it's a very important point, absolutely, and it's what we're living through now. Sorry, question.
Anila.
Yeah. Thank you very much for an interesting talk tonight. Why aren't there more of you talking about this history and maybe affecting the education system?
I'll honestly say, because I'm a working class boy from Bradford, honestly, you know, there is a fact that I'll still work in academia, and that of course it is an elite industry, and there's not enough black, Muslim, minority groups who are there, who are representing that. We might be teaching a lot of those students, and it might change over a long period of time, but still it's shocking when I look at the makeup of most history or English anthropology departments. I'm sure you have a sense of this as well. You know, if you take your kids to open days, you think, where's our representation? It's a real problem. So again, I work with many people who say, I don't believe this. I was saying over dinner that I have a very respected editor at Penguin Books, and when I said I wanted to write this book, he said, but there is no connection between the Islamic world and the Elizabethan world. I said, really? He said, yes. I said, how do you know? He said, because that's what I was taught. And I went, well, you were taught wrong. So it's...
When does the anti-Muslim and Islamophobic sentiment starts to creep in to the English society?
At what point? I mean, I think that's a really interesting question, which I think it is a later imperial moment. I don't think it's here. I really don't. What I sense is... Actually, what I sense in this period is what I like to call imperial envy. The English are actually envious of what they see in those cultures. They go to Isfahan, they go to Istanbul, they even go to Fez and Marrakesh, and they go, these are sophisticated, polyglot, wealthy societies. And you go back to London and you go, well, half the city's dying of plague. This is not a very cultured, civilized place. So, I mean, I think in very broad terms, I sort of see it as a much later 18th, 19th century moment around empire. It's about how empire wants to create a certain version, particularly of Islam, and that's demonized because it's what we're trying to control. I mean, that's a very crude way of putting it, but for me, it's not that it's there in this period. I don't think it is. And it's not to idealize this period, but it's to say this is a period where actually those Protestant societies are inferior to the Islamic world, and they're reaching out for an alliance, and they're trying to understand what they see there. They're not demonizing at that point. They're in effect, they're feeling sort of slightly inferior. And that, of course, shifts at a later point.
One question here, and then we'll come to the, this is a question from someone who really wanted to be here, but then unfortunately wasn't able to make it, but being relayed by his brother.
The question is, did any of the Muslim empires, to the best of your knowledge, launch colonial expeditions to the New World?
So what's That's a really good question, because the example of Muhammad al-Anuri, I don't know if we don't need to get it up, or maybe we can if we can show the al-Anuri image. The al-Anuri deal, al-Anuri comes in 1600 for these talks with Elizabeth. And what's extraordinary is that they say, the proposal is that Al-Mansur and Elizabeth will fuse their navies and their armies. They will launch a reconquest of Spain. So they will recreate Al-Andalus with Protestant support. And the documentation says, and then they will go and take the New World. So there is this kind of extraordinary account, which is Al-Mansur says, well, you've got a really good navy, Elizabeth. We've got loads of manpower, and we've got loads of gold from the Sudan. This is the story, because they've suddenly been massively enriched by raids into the Sudan. So Al-Mansur says, I can bankroll all this. You've got the navy. Let's take back Spain. Spain can be Muslim again, and then we'll invade the New World. I mean, it's extraordinary. And Elizabeth isn't saying no. She's saying, yeah, I've got a problem with the Ottomans, because, and the Ottomans at this point, as some of you will know, are making incursions into North Africa. So actually the Barbary states are quite conflicted with the Ottomans. So Elizabeth's weighing it up. It's not a sense in which we used to be told, oh, this is trading with the infidel. I mean, what the heck is that? You know, who's the infidel here? Right? So there is that great story that you have. And it doesn't happen. But as I say, it's not for any other reason than she decides that she wants to sustain the Ottoman alliance for longer. So yeah, there is a strange New World connection.
Is there any truth? I heard that the deal broke down because he was insisting that Elizabeth becomes a Muslim.
Inshallah. That would have been good. One of the interesting things actually to say about it, and this is, I don't know, we were talking about Palestinian figures. I don't know if you, there's a fascinating Lebanese academic called Nabil Matar. And if anybody wants to do any more work, he is one of the great figures. I bow down to Nabil Matar because he did a lot of this work way before I was doing it on Islam in Britain and talking about captives. He did all these, he found all these narratives about captives, Christians in the Arab world. Really interesting, in the Islamic world as well, in the Mediterranean. And if can we just get the Al-Mansur, the Al-Anuri. I've had a long conversation with Nabil about this, and Nabil's understanding of this, I think, is really interesting. He says, we don't have a portrait of Al-Mansur because, of course, he's good Sunni. He wouldn't have his portrait painted. Why did Al-Anuri allow himself to be painted? And Nabil has a really interesting theory. He thinks he's a Morisco, that he's a Spanish-born Muslim who's forcibly converted to Christianity. And then he escaped. He goes to the Barbary states so he can live within the Islamic domain, but therefore he's somebody who's multicultural, he's polyglot, he will have therefore learned Spanish, of course he'd have had Arabic, he would have spoken Italian as well. He's the perfect person to go to London because he's been across Spain, he's crossed religions, and he has reverted. So here he is as a Muslim figure. But I think he's probably more complicated than that as well. I think he was probably forcibly converted to Christianity and then reverted. So Nabil, I sort of thank for that. But it tells you an even more complicated story, I think, about the theology behind that portrait.
Khadija?
Thank you very much. My question is, I guess, pandering to people that would be skeptical. And I guess the question is around when do stories become historically significant, and how many do you need, especially when archives are being destroyed or sources are being destroyed. So when is it a handful of stories versus kind of something historically significant?
Well, it's rather like I said to my editor. I said every single famous Elizabethan that you can name, I can give him or her a connection to some Islamic dimension. You know, Walter Raleigh, Francis Drake, the Earl of Essex, Elizabeth, the spy master Walsingham. Francis Walsingham is running Harborne as a spy in Istanbul. right, to try and get Harborne to convince the Ottomans to attack the Spanish fleet in the Mediterranean, which then splits the Spanish Armada that sails in 1588, right? And the Ottomans are saying, yeah, we can think about this. Francis Drake brings back the Ottoman character called Chinana the Turk, who's then forcibly converted. The Earl of Essex is running Shirley. Everybody has some connection. The Earl of Leicester, the supposed, boyfriend of Elizabeth I, he bankrolled the Barbary Company. He knew exactly what he wanted from the Barbary Company, and he wanted a strategic political military alliance with the Barbary states. So all those figures have some connection. So I think it's a really good point, because in a sense I had to convince the editor and say, every single aspect of the Elizabethan elite world that you want to tell me about, I can tell you a story about that connection back to some aspect of the Islamic world, a community, an imperial conflict, a trading connection. Every single aspect. So I say, this is now part of the national story that we're supposed to tell. Don't tell me that it's not, or that it's marginal, because it's there everywhere. I should have said, great figure I'll give you, I missed that out, but with the drama of the period, because my day job is teaching Shakespeare, would you believe it? We've misunderstood this, so this is just fact. Between 1579 and 1624, I have 62 plays that have Islamic characters, themes, or settings. 62 plays, and there aren't that many that survive. So in that 40-year period, 62 plays. Marlowe's Tamburlaine, Jew of Malta, all the playwrights. There's a fashion. Every Elizabethan historian of drama has just completely failed to get this. There was a fashion to do plays about Turks, Moors, Persians, Saracens in the 1590s. Everybody did it. That's why Shakespeare does it. It's not just Othello, Titus Andronicus. There's a Moor. Jew of Malta. Hilariously, the play that's supposed to be anti-Semitism. Well, what do you know? One of the suitors to Portia is called the Prince of Morocco. Why is the Prince of Morocco suddenly popping up in Shakespeare's Jew of Malta? So Shakespeare is actually following fashion in this period, because everybody's doing plays about Muslims. Everybody. It's just a wild fashion. And it goes on and on, and it culminates with Othello, but Othello is just one example of, 60-odd plays like that.
Okay, loads of people have been asking, so I'm just going to take the last two questions from Samir and Alireza, and then we'll have to close, and if there are other questions, please talk to him afterwards. But
Thanks, Jerry. It was quite interesting to compare your book with Noel Malcolm's published this year, Useful Enemies, which is 1400 to 1700. And I think it's fair to say that he has a slightly more pessimistic take than you do. And he actually talks in the 16th century about phenomena of shame praising. So basically when people talk in praise in Europe, talk in praise of the Ottomans in particular, they're using it as a rhetorical strategy to say, well, even the Ottomans would do X, and you're even worse than them. I wonder whether you feel that exchange, trade, amicability, these are things we like to emphasize, probably because maybe to do with the current political situation we're in and all the rest of it, and whether there's perhaps a slight danger that we underplay the fact that these were, competing and mutually misunderstanding and all the rest of it.
Yeah, no, I don't deny that, but Sir Noel Malcolm, who works at All Souls and I think was probably a member of British intelligence and is one of the key backers of Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson's intellectual position on Brexit and everything to the right of that, is welcome to his opinion. I do say it as an ideological response because it makes me very, very annoyed. It's fine for Sir Noel Malcolm to take that position, and that's fine within a certain body of intellectual history. And I want to look at the politics of what he represents. So it's no surprise to me that he gives us that version of history. And I would just like to say I think there's a counterweight. But sadly, the Sir Noel Malcolms tend to win out.
Just wanted to thank you first, because the Oriental was actually quite useful for my second year studies a couple of years ago. So I was quite happy. Gave me
Many
years
ago.
Gave me a new perspective on history of three kingdoms, as it's now known. I just wanted to ask about how what your perspective is on Anglo-Ottoman relations, and how you've emphasized this importance of England and the Ottoman Empire. I want to know your perspective on why that declined later on, and only saw like a real resurgence of engagement after sort of Napoleon, effectively. More so in the sense that the Ottoman Empire starts to ally closer with France,
Yeah.
Catholic power.
Yeah, and there's also that disengagement. So there's a broader European disengagement, as you know, with the Ottomans. So and it's really usually defined as the conflicts, as far up as Vienna, so 1683 and then 1699, where the failure to sort of push through into that point of Europe leads to disengagement and a turning to the eastern frontier with Persia. So there is a way in which that disengagement takes place. And there is one argument that that's when you start to get that European Enlightenment moment, probably another answer to the question that was asked over there, where you start to get, and what Malcolm says, you can see there's a political conflict, which is why I was a bit brusque around the Malcolm argument, that there is then an argument about the Enlightenment. A European Enlightenment position starts to talk about enlightened political rational thinking, has to have its binary opposition, which is therefore despotic Oriental tyranny. And that becomes the seraglio. It becomes about what happens in Istanbul and that the court is overtaken by women, shock horror. It's that kind of argument about despotism, that you try and define your own enlightened political thinking in contrast to that form of despotism. And then I think that's what people like Edward Said pick up on and say, and that coincides with the intellectual discourse of Orientalism. And then, of course, you get it in the later 19th century imperial moment then becomes about the Ottoman Empire as the sick man of Europe. So again, that seems to me to fascinatingly collide with the moment where all the intellectual history is talking about the High Renaissance. Jacob Burckhardt writes The Civilization of Renaissance Italy in the 1850s, 1860s, and at that point you've already got a notion of the Ottomans as in decline. So what do you know? Burckhardt talks all about the Italian Renaissance city-states and absolutely no encounters or exchanges with the Ottoman world, which now everybody who works on the Italian Renaissance city courts know that all of those courts, in some way or another, were engaging and exchanging. And I should say, it's an interesting point that you make. It does stop in 1603. It wasn't just cute to say the Elizabethan world, because in 1603, what also happens is that when James I comes to the throne, he disengages. He doesn't want a political and commercial alliance. And it's this interesting moment with the rise of the joint stock companies, and particularly the East India Company. So he's happy to support the joint stock companies, but his different theological position means that he can't stomach the idea of that alliance with the Islamic world. So he does sort of say, no, I'm happy with the trade, but I want a disengagement that goes on there. So I think that's important, that happens as well. And then again, it's also as you start to get the intellectual interest and the establishment of chairs in Arabic in Oxford and Cambridge in the 1620s and 30s. So you get a different kind of intellectual engagement that goes on. So it's very specific to that sort of 1570 to 1603 moment of what I've been talking about. And the Malcolm thing sort of needles me a bit, as you can see, because of the politics of it. That's also very specific. It's a very specific moment of an encounter, which, yes, is different from what he's talking about, particularly with the French tradition, with people like Brotton and how they're using the Ottomans as a sort of way about talking about political representation. So, yeah, it does shift and it does change. And now more than ever, I think, with Erdogan and the way in which he's taking a sort of neo-sultanic line, it comes back into focus, the way in which, as anybody knows, you go to Turkey now, you go to Istanbul, and that sense of what Erdogan is doing is it's a reclamation of that idea of the Sultanate. That's one of the things that's making him so successful, because it's saying we can be the big strong man again in Europe.
Thank you very much. I know there've been at least 2 or 3 other people who wanted to ask questions who've already put their hand up. But there have been signs to say that we have to stop there. But you are around for a few minutes afterwards.
I'd love to carry on talking. Yes, please.
Can ask any other questions. Just a quick couple of announcements. This Sunday we have the